Welcome to HomeWord. I'm Jim Burns, and I'm so happy you've joined us today. We're going to have a great program. Parenting can be chaotic. It can be beautiful. It can be stressful. Did I mention chaotic and beautiful and stressful? Yeah. And truly, today I'm excited to have Justin Whitmel Earley with us today. His book, Habits of the Household, was published in 2021, and it has been on the top of the list of Christian parenting books since then. It's incredible, actually. It's having a remarkable impact all around the world because this is my background in terms of family ministry. I hear people talking about it everywhere. And there's a reason it's a bestseller. I think it's one of the best parenting books I have ever read. And you listen to this podcast, you've heard me not say that about other things. It's a great book. And that's kind of what I do. I read parenting books and I read marriage books, and here we are. So Justin is a writer. He's a speaker. He's an attorney. He's the author of Habits of the Household. He's the author of The Common Rule and Made for People. I've read 2 of the 3. Though he spends most days, you know what he's doing? He's running a business as a law practice. People who write parenting books don't do that. So this is going to be so cool. He continually explores both how physical habits are more spiritual than we think, and how spiritual habits are more physical than we think. And he lives with his wife and 4 boys in Richmond, Virginia, spends a lot of time around fires. We'll talk about that. Porches with friends and wrestling with those 4 boys. And you can follow him at justinwhitmelearly.com. And all of that is in our show notes. So there you go. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jim. That was a particularly enjoyable introduction. I like that.
Well, I've been looking forward to having you for a long time. And so, you aren't thinking about us, but I've been thinking about you. And your book really is amazing. Habits of the Household is unlike any book I've ever read on parenting. And I mean that. I told you that before we started. You did an amazing job of mingling authentic family life with spiritual rhythms and even liturgies. It's amazing. And when I recommend your book to people, I always say there is something that you can add to your life in parenting, and actually also one chapter on marriage from this book I like today. So anyway, I do love it. I honestly am not just, smoking whatever on it. Yeah. You don't have the typical family expert background. You are an attorney. You were a missionary in China. So I want you, before we start, I want to get the story behind the story. I mean, give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I started my life after college, graduated from University of Virginia in 2006, and went to be a missionary in China with Campus Crusade. Did that for almost 5 years and absolutely loved it. We could have hours of conversation just talking about life as a missionary in China. But towards the end of that time, I actually felt really called by the Lord to go to law school, which is a fairly weird statement. I've not met a lot of people who said, I felt called to go to study business law, but I honestly did. And a big part of my story is that in that transition of running really hard after being an excellent lawyer, because I really believed, and still do, frankly, that the Lord called me to this, I assimilated to all the typical habits and patterns of white-collar lawyering, top law school student, which I didn't really appreciate at the time how strange those are and how spiritual those are. Yeah. And the way I woke up to that is that in my first year of lawyering, I had a really spectacularly bad mental health collapse where I was really suffering from panic attacks, insomnia, coping in order just to sleep and function during the day. And I look back at that time, and I didn't have these words then, but now I see that the missionary had been converted to the nervous medicating lawyer like that, like really fast. Wow. Yeah. And that was what the Lord used to wake me up to the fact that your habits form you more than you think. Yeah. Because I had a really good worldview at the time, if I do say so myself. I had done half a seminary degree at RTS during my time in China. I read a lot. I was a thinking. I was a brain on a stick. Law degree, English major. I studied Chinese. I knew a lot, but what I didn't know, and this is how the Lord humbles you, was how significant your actual day-to-day patterns were. And that was about 10 years ago. But ever since, I've been writing, thinking, and frankly, just living in a different way, which is trying to say, if I actually want to be discipled by Jesus, what would that look like in ordinary daily rhythms?
Yeah, it's so good. And what's interesting about it for me is, I read a lot too, and I read about habits, but I don't usually hear I'd never read a book on habits in the household. I'm
Yeah,
thinking about habits more
right.
business and more life. And I'm, the leader of an organization called HomeWord. So I use these habits and goals, and I talk about leadership and that kind of stuff. But I had not integrated it into the family like you do. And yet, it's so well. In your book, you say that parenting happens in habits. The heart follows the habit. What does that mean?
Well, if you really understand the spirituality of habits, I think you first need to understand the physicality of them.
Mhm.
And briefly speaking, when we go into habit mode, which is, by the way, at least 40% of our life, our brain loves habits because it's a way to save energy. It's when our lower order brain, you call it lots of things, but basal ganglia area is churning along in habits. That means that your upper brain is free to make complicated decisions or process information. I mean, anybody listening to this right now is probably hearing our voices, processing information, and maybe doing something else by habit, tying their shoes, washing a dish, turning a car. And they can do all that safely and effectively by this beautiful power of habit. So
Yeah.
there's this neurological separation which really serves us until it's a bad habit. And
Mhm.
that's when, we think about habits the most because they are the most deleterious to our lives when they're addictions,
Right.
toxic patterns, unhealthy rhythms. And the thing about those, and this was a lot of my wake up, was realizing that what's not unusual is knowing those are bad. Like everyone knows those are bad. Everyone wants to change them. The problem is that part of your brain that knows better is not the part that's churning along in habit. Okay. And here's where the neurology starts to get really close to the theology. That means it's possible to know something and do the opposite. And as it turns
Mhm.
out, your life is formed a lot more by your habit than your head if the two are separated. The way I often put it is if your head's going one way but your habit's going the other, your heart tends to follow the habit. And that is really an exploration of the idea of liturgy and daily practice. And that might sound more complicated than it is. That's really the idea of just saying that if ordinary habits form who we are, and any psychologist will tell you ordinary habits form your identity, who you are, then that matches up perfectly with what the Bible has already told us, that we tend to become what we worship. The Psalms put it,
Yes.
we like those who make and trust in idols become like them. And
Yeah.
once that was a lot in 90 seconds, right? But once rewind and listen to that a couple of times if you want, but once you appreciate that ordinary habits are doing extraordinarily spiritually formative things in your life,
Mhm.
then suddenly you wake up to the idea that, oh, my heart is being tugged by habit everywhere in my day. And that the goal of a disciple of Christ should be not to have this fallen separation between our upper and lower brain, or between our head and our habit and our heart, but rather to intertwine the worldview with practice. And
Yeah.
so none of what we talk about should be to dismiss worldview or great knowledge. It should just be to say that alone is not discipleship. That, even the demons know Jesus' name. It doesn't mean they follow him. And so
Yeah.
the life of practice and following Christ is what he calls us to after he saves us. We're talking about the world of justification, to be clear, or sorry, sanctification, to be clear,
Yeah.
not justification. But
Yeah.
this is the idea that we're formed by our habits, and Christ wants us to follow him in all things.
Wow. Yeah. You're not sounding like an attorney. You're sounding like a theologian here. And plus an expert on brain. You must, I tell people that I'm kind of a brain nerd, and uh, and nobody ever goes, "That's awesome." They usually kind of look at me with kind of crossed eyes. I loved what you just said. One of the things that habits aren't easy, and you said a phrase that I underlined and then circled. Nothing important is easy. What did you mean by that when it relates to habits?
Oh, wow. I think about this all the time now. Really, since being a parent, honestly, Jim, is
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
I think it first settled in my late 20s, early 30s, when I was starting to parent young children, that the best thing in life was parenting, was having children.
Yeah.
And that was also the hardest thing in life.
Yes. Yeah.
And once that paradigm struck me through parenting, but once it did, I started to see it everywhere. And I started to realize that all the most wonderful things in life are quite difficult. They take a lot of work. Loving people, loving God, um,
Yeah.
becoming great at a sport, becoming great at a profession. Law school is so hard, and yet it's so rewarding to be an attorney. Learning Mandarin was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, and yet it was
Yeah.
so rewarding to speak to Chinese people in their own language. And,
Yeah.
thinking about the life of habit is not different. If you're thinking about your parenting life and you're thinking about the rhythms that plague us, I should say. I mean, parenting is hard. There's so many things I wanted to change and still do. Um, you know, it's one of those amazing realms where it's not complicated, as in the way to change is actually fairly simple.
Right.
It's just that doing it is quite hard. And so I
Yeah.
always want to make sure at the outset of any conversation like this, I remind people, like, if it feels hard, it's because it is. That doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's not worth doing. Again, all the
Right.
things that are most worth doing are hard. But
Right.
that's really something that, to close this thought, followers of
Yeah.
Jesus should be good at knowing, because we see that the most beautiful thing in the world was Jesus coming and dying and rising for us. That was a difficult thing, but it's also the most beautiful thing. So we should be
Yeah. No,
used to this paradigm.
I love that. And integrating it with the idea of family, because family's hard.
Oh
Family's
my gosh, it's
messy.
hard.
Family's beautiful. It's all kind of how I started, when it's chaotic, but it's also beautiful. But I think we have to acknowledge that it is hard, but there are some habits that we can apply. And you have one of the habits, and what you have habits, and in the time, I can't go through all the habits. That's why I
Yeah, right.
believe every person
Okay.
should go buy this book. But you have a habit that I thought was really neat, and it was something that I've been doing in my life for years. And you called it praying at the door of your kids.
Hmm.
How does that work for you? I mean, that's a habit that you have as a dad. Your kids don't even know about it because it's happening when the door's closed. You pray at the door. Talk about that.
This, I think, like a lot of my parenting habits, they're born out of actual difficulty and crisis.
Sure.
There was so much time, particularly in the early years of parenting, that I was spending in the hallways listening through my children's doors, right? Like wondering, are they in bed yet? Are they asleep yet? And then trying to sneak back.
Exactly. Right.
And it's late at night, you're frustrated, you're tired, and it's one of those things where all the difficulty hits all the beauty of it. And on the same note, it's like I'm caring for these children. I'm willing to stay up for them. And most nights weren't super holy and sacred. At least they didn't seem so. And yet it started to be a time where I was like, I could pray for them right now while I wait. Or when I would pass their door, I would think, are they okay? And then I'd think, well, maybe pray for them too. And sometimes I just lift my hand towards their door and say a quick prayer. And this was actually before a lot of the epiphanies that led to habits of the household, and before I started doing bedtime liturgies with them. But it was early on, I think, where I started to realize that these moments of sleeping and going to bed were actually wonderful places to put prayer. And speaking of habit, when you start to intertwine disciplines like that into the day, this amazing things happen. You start to become the kind of person that prays without ceasing, which is right. Like I never became, I was, even as a missionary in China, I was never really a person of prayer until I started thinking about prayer and habits. And then it started punctuating the day. And now I'm like, oh yeah, I see what Paul means when he says pray without ceasing.
That's really neat. And yet a lot of life, and you've alluded to this like crazy. I mean, talking about spiritual life, a lot of the spiritual work that we do is in the normal moments of domestic life. It's kind of mundane, but how do you integrate this mundaneness? Because a lot of it is.
Yes.
How do you integrate that into more meaning?
Yeah. Well, I think by habit, right? So this is what the book is about. So anybody who wants the full answer on this, I commend it to you. But I will say this: I started as a missionary in China, and I remember the whiplash of early stage parenting when I thought, oh my gosh, like all we're doing, and particularly, my wife, probably 10x, had this feeling, like all we're doing is cleaning up human fluids, rocking little babies, cleaning the house after them. Like life has become these series of mundane small services. And I read this amazing book during this time called Finding God at Home. I would actually commend it to anybody. It's by a Catholic writer who wanted to become a monk and yet fell in love and had children. And it was his slow realization that actually his spiritual call of spiritual service was in the home. The book's out of print. It's called Finding God at Home. It's a beautiful little book. But that was one of the tip-off moments for me that I thought, oh my gosh, wait, maybe this is the new mission field, and I don't need to leave the house to find an extraordinary field of serving the Lord. Right here in changing these diapers and being patient with these children and loving this wife is an extraordinary missional call. And writing Habits of the Household was actually the way I think that the Lord helped me start to flesh out, well, what would that call look like then? Like, what would it actually look like on a daily basis? But it fundamentally shifted my paradigm of saying, this is not a distraction from the work of ministry. This is the ministry.
Yeah. It's funny. You mentioned monk, and I can remember years and years ago reading a book by a guy named Brother Lawrence, and
Wonderful
he was
book.
talking about practicing the presence by washing dishes. And to me, I
Mhm.
was like, I hate washing dishes. I don't want to practice his presence. And yet,
Right.
what you're saying is in the mundane of changing diapers or dealing with body fluid and whatnot, it is. And I know this sounds kind of monkish still, but you talk about these habits, and one of the habits is waking. And you called it waking up in the light of the story of God. And that's a beautiful phrase. But one of the habits that you said, because these are really practical habits a lot of times, because we've been talking more about the,
Yeah,
more the intellectual
theory of it,
side.
right?
But one of the things that you said in this is you said you wanted to make a habit of looking at scripture, this is in waking, before the smartphone. That was life-changing for me.
Oh my gosh.
Talk about that for you.
Well, the lack of it was life-changing for me first. So when I first started lawyering, it became my new norm to read my work emails immediately when my eyes opened. And there was a particular morning, I think I tell about it in this chapter of the book, where I woke up, heard my son crying, was about to go help him, but found myself 5 minutes later reading my work emails on the foot of my bed while he was still crying. And this was,
Right.
this wake up moment before he was fine, right? He just needed his pacifier. But I literally and metaphorically woke up that morning and realized that I had become more attentive to the cries of my office than the cries of my son.
Such a line.
That's in a disturbing line, right? Like I was scandalized actually by my own self. And that was, again, if you read my books, you'll read a lot of these, oh my gosh, I messed it up so bad moments. And one, I hope that comforts you. We all do. But two, this is what you call a moment of grace, right? This is your moment where you feel, oh my gosh, I'm doing the wrong thing and my life needs to change, is the Holy Spirit coming to you and saying, by the way, you can change. By the way, I want you to change. By the way, tomorrow doesn't have to be like today. And that was an important wake up for me to say, I don't want to live like this. And I could talk about technology and the formation that we experience there for days, but I would just cap it like this. We're formed in the image of what we gaze at because, like we just said, habits are worship. Ordinary things are worship. And that is going to be most particularly relevant right now for any modern person in the realm of their smartphone. And so the habit for me of saying, as a habit, not a rule, so I'm not always perfect at it, but it is almost every day now, it's just become normal, 10 years now, is saying I'm not going to look, I literally refuse to open my phone until I've done some time, in a devotion or reading, prayer, scripture. And that does two things, Jim. One, it gets my phone out of my morning. And that is an incredible service to my family, not to mention to my mental health. As it turns out, most emails can wait. And two, it gets the scripture into my life. And, I hope I don't need to convince anybody listening, but I'll just say it because it helps us. The word of God actually does change you. It actually is a double-edged sword. It pierces your heart. It changes you. And so this is sort of exponential formation here because you're removing the formation of the phone, bringing in the formation of scripture. And for me, it's just become a practice to live by. It's not a law, but it's a really wise thing. And it's helped habit lead the heart for me in that area.
That is so good. And again, we could talk about screens, and you actually have another part on screens, but we could talk about that all day. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Incredible conversation. I kind of feel like we're walking on holy ground today with Justin. We're talking about finding meaning in the daily chaos of raising kids, and his book is called Habits of the Household. And if you're going to read one book this year, again, I tell people read one parenting book at least a year, one marriage book a year. Read this one, okay, if you haven't read it. All of Justin's information is found on the podcast show notes. And since I mentioned China, or since he mentioned China, I just want to say a special shout out to the people who listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube. In China, of the top 20 international cities, we've got 3 in China, Indonesia, Korea, Japan. It's pretty incredible. So maybe one day we'll have him, greet you in Mandarin, since I don't know. I was speaking in Beijing and I didn't know one word. I could not pronounce one word, so that wasn't very good. Anyway, honored to have him with us today. We'll come right back. Don't go away. Hi, Jim Burns here from HomeWord. There are so many great things happening at the HomeWord Ministries. And you know what? The greatest thing is my new friend, Marcus Preciado, who is our new president, an incredible leader with great vision. And he's going to tell you a little bit about some of the new things.
Thanks, Jim. Everyone, so excited about what God has for us here at HomeWord, and thank you for being a part of it as well. To give you a sneak peek of what's coming next year and beyond, we're going to be expanding our podcast team, bringing new voices and new faces. We're very excited about that as well. Also, HomeWord Hubs. We're going to have feet on the ground in every region of the United States so we can have hands-on ministry and take HomeWord to the nation, as well as establishing Project HomeWord, which is going to be a resource like no other to help families succeed. So thank you for being supportive. Thank you for being part of our community. And as this year is ending, I want to encourage you to pray about generosity and being a part of what HomeWord's doing, and we can partner together to help families succeed.
Okay, welcome back. What an incredible conversation we're having. Justin, you know, one of the habits that you talk about is discipline. And again, it's one of these things that we could talk about this all day.
Right.
But you said moments of discipline are hard because there is a wide gap with what I want and what they need.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to unpack that for me.
I think discipline shows us the realm of habit perhaps more clearly than anything we've talked about, because discipline is where we are almost always acting out of instinct, which is another sort of way to put habit. Like, you know, when I'm trying to think of a recent example, but when I walk in and the house any given evening, and you know, one of my sons hugs me and the other son is jealous that one got to me first, and so he punches him. It's like, yeah, I didn't plan on this. I was planning on a family, you know, reunion or gathering.
A love fest, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, and now I'm, oh my gosh, you know, barking at somebody. And it just goes to show you what we were talking about earlier, that, you know, so much of our life and our family life is informed by those knee-jerk habits, how we snap at our children. And, you know, that line, I remember working on that sentence. It was carefully crafted because what we want is just peace. Like, we want to be done with this. We wish it didn't happen, and we want to get away from it. So maybe we get there by control. Maybe we get there by ignoring. Neither of those, what we want or what our child needs. And that is discipleship, because they are, you know, a wayward heart. They're a beautiful image bearer, but they're also a fool, and they need discipleship. And, you know, it doesn't take a genius to see that there's a root etymology here of discipline and discipleship. And I realized that a lot of my instinctual habit response to discipline was just control, because I just wanted them to stop or be quiet. And what they needed was discipleship. And so a lot of my thinking through, well, how could I interrupt my instincts? How could I interrupt my habits with better ones was rooted there. And I'll just tag on, Jim. This is actually a very important idea in this conversation. Just like you can never stop loving something, you just have to find a greater love. This is important that everybody understands this sort of theology of the human heart. You can't just say, stop loving that. I mean, if we could stop our hearts from loving, life would be so much easier, right? But we have to we have to fall in love with something higher, something greater. Habits are exactly like that. You can't just break a habit. It's actually a bad way to put it. What you do is replace it with a better habit. And you can apply this to exercising, weight loss, anything. But in discipline, what I needed to do was, in order to stop my bad habit of yelling and trying to control my children's behavior, was replace it with different habits of discipleship. And that was...
Give me an illustration.
Yeah, pause prayers are the number one thing that I like to talk about, because it's with my little kids and my adolescent now. It's so helpful to me to, before I enter a moment of discipline, to briefly pause and pray, and emphasis on brief, right? Because sometimes, you know, one is bashing the other with a Nintendo Switch controller, so you've got to go intervene, right? Like,
quickly.
But I'm talking about on the way up the stairs, even honestly, just saying, Lord, help me bring your grace and truth to this interaction. Or often for me, it's, Lord, help me be patient. Lord, help me be a little bit more like you. Sometimes it's, Lord, help me see that I'm more like this child than I think. And that to me is a mnemonic. It's always a way for me to remember that, you know, I'm pretty much a mess too. And so is every other parent that I met. And Shisha, it would be really nice if all of us had parents to parent us while we were parenting them. And as it turns out, we do. His name is
Yes.
Jesus. He's there with us. And we want to look up to him and say, Lord, help me be more like you than me in this moment. And so it should not be a surprise that prayer changes us, but it was surprising to me how much my reaction is different when I pause to pray first. And I'll just give you a brief example if you don't mind, because I think this might help.
Go with it.
So just recently, with one of my older children, I'll try to be sort of anonymous now that they're older. This child is basically, burgeoning on adolescence. That he's there, and we just had an episode in the car the other month where he punched one of his brothers, totally inappropriate. Made me so mad. Of course, we're on the way to church of all places that we're blowing up in the car. And Jim, I just wanted to turn around and be like, how dare you, right? And just yell him into like, how dare you hit that small child? Like, you're so much bigger. Why would you do that? And I just remembered my own thing that I talk about all the time, pause prayer. So I paused and I was like, Lord, help me to enter this moment with your grace and truth. And I got out of the car and I said, hey, you and I need to talk. Everybody else going to church. We're going to take a little walk. And before I could turn to him to say anything, and I wasn't even sure what I was going to say yet, he looked at me and he said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I reacted out of anger. It makes me so frustrated that I do this, but I did it. I'm sorry. And I was like stunned. I'm even feeling stunned now because this was one of the first moments he ever owned his behavior in a mature manner. And I could look back at him honestly and say, oh my gosh, son, that sounds exactly like me. That's exactly what I struggle with. I find it so hard to control my anger. You and I are the same. This is, what we talk about when we say, good thing Jesus died for us and is working with us and rose again for us, because you and I need help. And that was a moment we never could have had if I just exploded in anger. So
it's beautiful.
Pausing to pray opens up the Lord uses this to open up so much opportunity with your children.
So good. God, this has gone so much deeper and focusing on us as parents so much. The interesting side, within your book, you have a lot of practical things. I mean, just super practical, like, this is super hyper practical. So we talked about screen time, and I want to come back just real quickly because you have some really good practical tips. And I think a lot of our listeners, whenever we do a podcast on screen time, it's always more downloads, that kind of a thing.
Right.
And so it's there's a discipline to this. You make it a habit. We talked a little bit about the screen time side, but give us just some of the practical tips that a parent can do to try to, get their arms around this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need help here. We need help. I would refer anybody listening to go to hang10movement.com, because my wife and I just about a month ago, it's very recent, put up a website, and we're trying to inspire parents, churches, schools, and communities to adopt similar technology practices in the household. Because otherwise it's a race to the bottom. It's very hard to have different smartphone habits with your child when the house next door or the church youth group is doing something different, or when all the events are planned on Facebook and you're trying to keep them off Facebook, whatever. So I say that because if you want some real nitty gritty, go check. There's 10 practices there. But I will say, in general, Jim, what we're trying to do in the house, I think, is a matter of discipleship, is to preserve a embodied childhood that is mostly free from screens the younger they are, and slowly apprentices them into the use of screens the older they get. And so the major flip, just to give you one habit, I think, is to assume that normal moments in your house should be screen free as a default, and then carefully choose the ones that will involve screens. And that's just a flip on modern life, because the modern life is typically, all of it should be on screens. And I think when you do that on purpose, then you run to some really great things. Because, by the way, I'm a corporate lawyer who uses screens all the time. Like, I am not a Luddite, right? I love it. And we do family movies together. Our kids are allowed to have, video game time. We are going to give our adolescents soon a text, based dumb phone. And so we're like apprenticing them into this. We choose these on purpose, but that means that family dinners, normal evenings around the living room,
Yeah.
Lauren and I's interactions with them. One of our things is we have a box in our foyer where we put our phones when we get home. So they're going to live there unless we choose to go get them. That means most of our time is analog, and that is beautiful because we were made for presence, and screens are the cause of our absence in the household.
Well, thank you for saying that. Tell me again, it's hang10.com?
hang10movement.com.
hang10movement.com. That'll be on our show notes, by the way, folks, and do take a look at that. Very practical input. One of the things, you have a habit on family devotions, and that was a bad word in our family until my wife started doing them, because my family devotions, I would tell them, in the Greek, it means this. And I would start talking to them, and the kids would go, no, not family devos. Kathy brings, chocolate and red vines, and we do experiences. And the kids were like, this is awesome. They never, and she didn't call it family devos. But one of the things you talked about, and you had a section on Jesus and messy kids. And you've used the word messy a lot. Families are messy. And I think God's okay with messes. That's what we forget. We think he's not okay because maybe we had a overbearing dad or somebody like that, and they weren't good with messes. But I think our Lord is okay with messes. But how do you get comfortable to fit in family devotions with the kids? Your kids are getting a tad bit older now, because you got adolescents, you got them kind of just going there, but then you have younger ones too.
Right.
So they're even developmentally different age-wise.
Yeah.
So how do you approach kind of the messiness of family devotions?
Well, I think first you got to know that's the mess is okay, and two, you just got to practice. So one, you kind of just said, grace means that Jesus finds us in our mess and loves us anyway and calls us forward, and that is astoundingly applicable to family devotions, which, by the way, we call it family time. And
Kathy called it family time. She moved it from the Devo was a bad word. It's like a cuss word to them.
And it's just like one of right. It's just like one of those little things that you can do to make it sort of okay. Like, this isn't going to be a super formal time. One of the best habits we ever did here was just kind of like what your wife did, and that was we brought in snacks. So honestly, our kids will ask, sometimes even beg, can we do family time tonight? Because they know it's going to mean they're going to get some chips or ice cream or cookies or something. And so
I love it.
And by the way, this kind of goes like what we're talking about with screens too. When you choose your snack times carefully, or your ice cream times carefully, your screen time carefully, they become special times. And you lean into them. And family time is special because we're going to get a snack, and we're going to then read a Bible story together out of a kid's book. We're going to maybe practice a catechism together. Recently, we just went through every line of the Lord's Prayer and talked about, what does that mean? This is not hard. Like, there's no lesson plan. There could be. You can go through great family devotion books. But I'll tell you one great practice, Jim, we've had recently. And by the way, I'm into part 2 now. You just practice, right? You do it over and over, and you're okay with the mess. And we recently did a thing that we do sometimes where I say, all right, this is question time during family devotion. You ask me any question you have about life, and I'm going to try to give you an answer from the Bible. And so our 6-year-old will ask, he'll like look at the table and he'll be like, why do oranges exist? And we'll talk about God creating this bizarre and beautiful world, and that, fruit is actually pleasing to the eye and good for food. And isn't he an amazing artist who would make something as sweet and quirky as an orange? And then my 12-year-old will ask, when do you start liking going to church and studying the Bible? Because I feel like I should like it, but I don't like it. And we talked about kind of what we talked about earlier, how lots of things are hard. And actually the best things in life, like coffee or fine food, you don't like the first time. You got to practice. And then you realize, this is the best thing in the world. Reading the Bible is amazing. Yeah. And, I say that just say there's been a ton of mess in our family times. Good. But I think often about, can we make this fun? Can we eat something? Can we just speak normally about the things that are most important in life? And as it turns out, you don't need training for that. You just need to carve out a space. Right. And so try it. I mean, God will exponentially bless the time you spend with your children like this. And we just do it once a week on Wednesday nights. And it's just been a beautiful thing for our family.
Yeah, no, I love that. We always kind of called it KISS, keep it short and simple too. But we had an experience, and I'm laughing about this because what you said, we had an experience where we had some money at the end of the year, and it was like $500. Mm-hmm. So I went to the bank. I don't know if I'd ever held a $100 bill because I'm using credit cards or whatever. Right. And so I gave each of our family, with 3 daughters and my wife and myself, we all had a $100 bill. And I said, so this isn't our money. This is God's money. And I want you to come, you have 24 hours, and then we're going to decide, you can decide how to give this money away. And so the girls came back together, and, one girl, we have a ministry in Ecuador, and she was like, I think we should give it to Ecuador. She ended up being a missionary in Ecuador after
wow.
college. Another one wanted to take care of the poor people who needed blankets. That was all she had. Kathy said something, I said something, and then our youngest, she started crying, and she goes, I lost the $100 bill. And so we all went to, my mind was, seriously, she's 5 at this point. And I'm like, oh, this is not a good idea. And so we stop any kind of thing, and she lost the $100 bill. We never found it until like about two weeks later. Kathy found it someplace, and everybody was mad at her. So we went from this beautiful I thought this was going to be this amazing giving moment, teaching them what they could do with the money and how God, uses our stewardship and all this, to seriously, you lost the $100 bill. And then, of course, Kathy says to me later, that's probably a dumb idea to give a 5-year-old a $100 bill. That's not, she doesn't know what that means. Right.
Right.
That's but it was
hilarious.
Just funny because it was this beautiful thing. And then it turned into, my worst nightmare.
Well,
we did find the $100 bill.
Let me just tack onto that, because that's a great example. There's so many times where we're trying to do something profound, beautiful, meaningful for our children.
Right.
And yet they actually are children. So they interrupt, or they're frustrated, or they don't like it or appreciate it as much as we think. And I just want to remind anybody, this goes for family devotions, but all of parenting, that in those moments where you think you're discipling your children, remember, God is using their response to you to disciple you. And it's sort of the question of, can you be gracious in this moment?
Yeah.
Can you take your intentions that are switched and now be discipled? And so when I think about this all the time in family devotions, can I not just tell them about the love of God in this moment, but can I show them by being patient as they don't want to listen?
Right. And that's so good. Actually, that's kind of the lesson of this conversation. There's so much that we can learn and then, distribute. I wanted to talk about marriage. I wanted to talk about the other things. We'll have to do that another time. Time has gone by so fast. Thank you, Justin, so much for being with us. Thank you also for writing this incredible book and given you have amazing talent. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. I mean,
so good.
The Lord has blessed this. I wrote it during the pandemic when I was thinking I really should be practicing law right now. I don't know what I'm doing as a young parent writing a parenting book, and just goes to show you that Lord uses our fumblings.
Well, no, isn't that amazing to actually be, the best, no doubt, the best-selling parenting book since that time. Mm-hmm. Amazing, really, truly amazing. We're in a group of people we meet about every 6 weeks, and it's 3 attorneys and then me. Are the men.
Oh, and the women. I'm sorry for you.
There's time when I'm with these guys and they're talking about cases. One of them is a judge, so they're talking about different cases. We're in Orange County, California. Right. And finally I go, you know what? No offense to you guys. I'm going to go talk to the women about menopause or their kids or, whatever it is. And it's just funny. So I go, hi. And then they'll be in the middle of a conversation. I'm like, I'm not really understanding what my attorney friends are talking about. And I'm not sure what I want to be in on the menopause conversation.
You're a true outsider. Yeah.
Yeah. I truly feel outside. But anyway, again, thanks so much for being with us. By the way, all information about Justin is found in our podcast show notes, as well as we'll have access to 2 different websites that we talked about. And if you have information or questions or thoughts on our podcast, go to homeword.com. That's HOMEWORD, and let us know what you think about today's podcast. This was a great conversation. I am thrilled that we had this conversation. And I know someone could benefit from this conversation. So I hope you'll subscribe to our podcast. Maybe you already do. But if you like it, and send it to your friends. It's a privilege to bring guests with the kind of ability that Justin has, and I just love my job. I love doing this. So again, thanks for listening, watching on the HomeWord YouTube channel if you do it that way. Until next time, I'm Jim Burns, and you're listening to HomeWord.